Now I'm going to open the floor for the question from our speakers who, if everyone has any question, can even say or even write it in the chat. And I'm going to ask also to our speakers. Okay. Okay, I'm going to do the first question just to make breaking a bit ice about the presentation of Professor Oliver Scharbrodt, which I found it also very interesting, his presentation about the concept of the national component of the Shia population in UK. And especially if those 20 communities you mentioned, if they have any relationship with each other and if they are organizing some important events in Shia faith together, if you could speak about that. And my next question would be also about the concept of the Norwegian youth people, the Shia people in Norwegia, from Professor Ingvild Flaskerud, we basically explain the challenging of these Shia youth people in Norwegia if the Norwegian government has any program or took part of to basically to help or improve the situation about the problematic which they are facing today. So I stop here with these two questions, and in case we will have more questions, we'll continue. Otherwise, I will ask other two questions from our two other speakers. Please, if you would like to answer.
Sure, thanks a lot for the question. I mean, there is not really a kind of a national umbrella body bringing these different communities together. I mean, of course, I was talking about a particular area in London. I mean, there have been efforts, I think, around sort of 6-7 years ago, there were some efforts made to create some sort of UK Shia council and bring these different communities together. And there were some steps made to establish it. But, it wasn't really very successful because, again, of competition and a certain rivalry between these different community centers and the people who lead them. Also the question, well, who's going to run the show? Who's going to become the public face of Shia Islam? So yeah, in the wider UK context, there isn't really such a representation. It doesn't necessarily mean, despite perhaps the competition between these different centers and their specific clerical and political allegiances and the rivalry that might exist, sometimes very personal ones, between people leading them or involved in them. It doesn't mean that there's no interaction. They visit each other, families intermarry and so on. So there's not, a clear sort of segregation between them. I should perhaps also add an important caveat here, that the scenario that I outlined in terms of what's happening in London or in this particular part of London is not necessarily representative for the whole of the UK. And this also goes back to Ingvild's question. It's quite it's an interesting site for research because you've got all these community centers there and their transnational links. But as soon as you move outside of London, you have a very different scenario where you have very small communities, where you have much more interaction between Shiis of Iranian, South Asian, Iraqi background, where again the sort of institutional infrastructure is very weak, and different Shiis share particular facilities where they're forced to cooperate more, and so on. So the kind of London scenario, how interesting it is not really representative for what's going on outside of the capital, where there is much more cooperation and much more pragmatic adjustments because of the small numbers. It's just because the concentration demographically of Shia communities there, that you know, they can afford the luxury to create all these different centers.
Thank you very much, Professor Scharbrodt, for your answer. And I'm going to ask the floor to, yes, please, Professor Flaskerud, if you want to answer.
Yes. So if I understand you correctly, you want to know whether the government has any facilities to help the youth in what they're doing.
Exactly.
Yeah. I would say maybe no, but the distance between the government and the people, in a way, it's not that large. So we see, for example, that the youth can write in newspapers, and there is a debate evolving. One newspaper picks it up, another one is forwarding, and suddenly things are circulating in the media and on Facebook, for example, and so on. And suddenly there will be a minister who is interested in improving situation for Muslims, or work with integration, or whatever is the issue that they have. Then they could invite these people in, and to participate on a roundtable discussion, for example, and so on. And these things do happen. There are individuals in these groups who, I think the most important thing with these groups is that they themselves train themselves to give presentations, to focus on a topic, to sharpen their ideas, and so on, so that eventually they will enable themselves to reach out, to write in the newspaper, to have whatever kind of public statement that they would like, and to enter into a dialogue with various types of levels of politician and governance in the country.
Okay, thank you very much for your answer. I'm going to let Professor Aviastor has a question, please.
Yeah, thanks for the wonderful talks. My question is for Emmanuel. Emmanuel, I really enjoyed the talk. And one question I have is whether, I mean, you seem to generalize from the British case to Europe as a whole. And I'm wondering whether we would see a similar Shia rights discourse emerge in somewhere like France, where there is more pressure to couch your claims in a more sort of universal way. My second question is whether what we're seeing is the sort of generalization of a form of identity politics, a certain repertoire that all groups are using, whether they're racial, religious, gender, you know. What would you say to somebody who says that that's what we're seeing, as opposed to something specific about religion and secularism?
Thank you. Those are both really good questions. To answer the first question, yes, I did slightly generalize from the UK case, and the reason was that was sort of time limitations. In the paper, I do look at other cases as well, especially sort of Scandinavia, where I mean, Ingvild was also presenting, and how there are these similar discourses. I think France, Italy, and Spain are quite different. So I think this also sort of ties into the argument that I have, that it's more about the mode of secularism that functions within that particular country that then shapes how Shias might be able to respond to that. So in France, you have a very, very different model of secularism that is not at all this multicultural secularism that we have in the UK, and it's much more of this sort of blanket, oh well, we're not religious, we're just all Republican. So I haven't done a lot of fieldwork on French Shia. There aren't a huge amount to begin with, but I think, yes, it's definitely worth looking at the specifics of the different countries, but I still don't think that that will undermine the overall argument, because ultimately I'm saying that it's about the way in which Shia rights manifests is about the form of secularism that they're responding to. So yeah, so, but I think it would be really interesting to look at how these different countries and how communities in different countries are responding. And to your second question, well, I think it puts me in a slightly difficult position, because I would say that it is exactly that it's exactly that it isn't really specifically about religion at all, that it's that this is how identity politics is working in the kind of contemporary world. And whether you're a religious minority, a gender minority, a ethnic minority, a racial minority, it's just about how minority identity politics are functioning, and how these different, the kind of fragmentation of identity that you get with modern capitalism, and the segmentation of the market, and the specificity and the diversification of identity groups. I would say it's 100% that. So I think it's difficult for me to respond to someone who says that, because and that's really the argument I make in my book, that it's not, I'm taking Shia Muslims as a case study, but ultimately it's not really about Shia Muslims at all. Yes, of course, there are specificities, and you could argue and say, well, no, there's this sort of theological dimension, and it's really interesting to look at that. But for me, I'm not a theologian, I'm not an Islamic studies scholar, I'm a political scientist. So for me, it's about politics, it's about identity politics. So yeah, perhaps that's not very good answer, but.
Thank you. Thank you very much, both of you. I'm going to ask a very short question about the Professor Ahmadvand, and about if there is any relation between the universities and institutions inside of Iran with other institutions and universities or places in which they are focusing about the Shia studies, especially in Europe, together. If you could just explain, because your recent book is about the concept of the Shias in Western. So if today the inside of Iran, these kind of institutions and universities, they have any relationships with other institutions outside of Iran, and basically they have any collaborating to publishing or to translating the works which they are writing inside of Iran and outside of Iran, and these kind of relationships.
Yes, thank you. As you know, there are some collaborations between Iranian universities and other universities, but unfortunately, the collaborations now, I'm speaking now, between scholars, personally between the scholars. I hope so. I hope so, and I think your nice effort and activities here in this study, Shia Study Day, helps us to open new windows and horizons. I hope so.
Okay, thank you very much. There is also another question from Yafa Shanik, please.
Yes, thank you very much. My question actually also is to Emanuele. Thank you very much. Really interesting paper. I would like actually to push you a bit more on Avi's point about generalization within, the presentation of Europe. But not only that, I also felt there was a generalization within how you understand human rights discourses developed in the West versus the East. As you said that you feel that Shia rights can, the whole discourse is, as can only work within Europe, within the context of secularism. And I'm just wondering about that argument, and whether you are ignoring human rights discourses within, for example, the Middle East and all the human rights movements that's been going on there, and that there is also a huge number of activities in that direction. So it's not just something that's generated in Europe, as you said, as a from the Enlightenment period until today, but also actually happened in other areas as well, and the Middle East particularly in the last few, maybe a couple of years, like 10 years ago or something, that we have an increase in human rights discourses, awarenesses, and also UN based activities there as well, and a lot of humanitarian agencies as well. So I'm just, you know, I think it's a nice angle to talk about, but do you see it only limited to the European context and not at all in any other context, like for example within human rights discourses in the Middle East? Thank you.
Thanks, Yafa. That's a really good point. And I would, you had sort of two questions. One was about the generalization of the European case. I think, again, that's partly just because time limitations in the presentation, I wasn't able to go into all the different cases. And also I should caveat it slightly and say that, you know, here I'm making much more of a discursive argument. So it's not really, so it's more about how this discourse functions. So I'm trying to sort of pair out the discourse and see how it works. And I think that also relates to your second question. I think you're completely right, 100%. There are many campaigns and organizations, and even if you look not just in recent years, but you know, the tradition of Islamic philosophy, and there are these discourses of rights and representation. But I'm more interested in, so what I'm looking at in the paper is how this functions in the European context. And I'm also sort of placing myself within the post-colonial literature. So there's a lot of literature on, say, rights movements in the Middle East or in India or South Asia, which would argue that a lot of the discursive underpinnings of those rights movements also come from the colonial era and also rooted in Enlightenment discourses. There are kind of counter arguments to that obviously come from the Islamic tradition. But what I'm trying to say is that the way in which Shia rights is being articulated in the UK and in Europe more broadly is that the kinds of discourses that these movements are drawing on are not the Islamic discourses. Yes, they use the figure of Imam Hussein and they use the example of the Battle of Karbala, but ultimately they're not really rooted in Islamic theology. They're rooted in the more Enlightenment, humanitarian, Western tradition of human rights. So it's the kind of linking up of those two different ideological paradigms that I find really interesting. Of course, that's not to say there are not indigenous rights movements in the Middle East and elsewhere, but I'm specifically kind of bracketing off this case and saying, well, what are these guys doing and why is it interesting and what does it say about Europe and secularism? And I think one of the things that I'm trying to look at in my work more broadly is I'm trying to argue against this idea of Islamic exceptionalism, that Muslims are somehow this unique community in Europe and that no one else is like Muslims. I actually think that the way in which Muslim minority identities are mobilizing and are forming themselves replicates many other forms of minority identities. So Muslims are not that unique. And I don't mean that in a negative way, I mean that in a positive way, in that we shouldn't fetishize Islam, we shouldn't I think there is especially in some of the literature, there is this tendency to sort of say, well, Muslims are the unique fifth columnist in Europe, and I would argue that that's not the case. But I would love to do some more work on sort of indigenous Islamic discourses of human rights and how that also feeds into this. But that's something for the future, perhaps. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the question and also the answer. Now there is another question from Dr. Minomir Shahvalat. Please ask your question.
Yeah, thank you all and every one of you, and for the interesting discussions. I have two questions. One of them is for Professor Ahmadvand and regards the relation, if I don't know if it exists and if he knows that we have some sort of relation between the European traditionalism, the field of study and thought that comes from Genon, Orientalism, and the Shia studies that he has researched about in his book. And the other question is for Dr. Delius Posti, and I was wondering whether in her research she has noticed any role in the case of the so-called Shia rights, if we can suppose any role for Maraja, and if they have in their discourse have pushed or have proposed something regarding Shia rights in Europe. Thank you.
Sorry, the question was about the relationship between traditional institutions in the West?
Now, I was wondering whether you have noticed any relationship between European traditionalist authors, I mean the authors that the tradition actually that starts from Yunan, Orientalism and the Shia study in the West.
Yes, you know, in Iran, some of them are very famous, like Yunan, like Burkhardt and so on. And as I understand what you said exactly, Dr. Said Hossein Nasr actually has two faces. One of them is a very famous Shia scholar, and the other one is a famous traditionalist, you know. But exactly, I don't know the question, unfortunately. My information is at least about this. Sorry.
Hi, thanks. And I think you had the question about whether the Maraja are making any kind of statements on this. I'm afraid I don't have a very good answer to that, because my research is focusing on the grassroots movements. So I haven't really looked at Maraja rulings and fatwas and that, unless they specifically come up in what the grassroots are saying. And so off the top of my head, I don't know, and I'm sorry that that's not a very good answer. But I'm sure that there must be some kind of I think I have a feeling that Sistani may have said something about sort of Shia rights abuses in Pakistan, specifically given the context of the last few years. But beyond that, I really can't answer that, and I'm sorry, but one for the future, perhaps.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for your questions and also for the answers. Now we are going to finish the first part of this panel, the first part. So thank you all who are speakers and also the audience that participated basically at this first part of this conference. So now we are going to have 10 minutes break. We are a bit running out of the time. So we are going to have 10 minutes break, and we're coming back here again to following the second panel, which are the case studies, and which will be moderated with Dr. Misha Khalaf. And then we are going to have a bit long break for lunch, and we continue our panel at 2:30, which will be moderated by the Dr. Talia. Thank you, everyone, and see you in 10 minutes. Just have a coffee, and we continue our panel.